Hello again, IB Psychology students, and here is the section on how to write the evaluation for your IA. Please don't forget to press that like button or subscribe if you would like more videos on IB Psychology. Now, your evaluation section is worth 6 marks, and it really should be packed full of evaluation and really sophisticated and refined and focused critical thinking. And once again, here are the books that I have co-authored specifically for IB Psychology. Very user-friendly, definitely recommend them. Available on Amazon. Now, the thing to start off with is your results. You need to discuss your descriptive statistics, that's your mean and standard deviation, and your inferential statistics. So you don't need to overthink this, it's quite straightforward. Look at your descriptive statistics. What do they literally show? Have you seen a difference in conditions? Was one of the mean scores for one of your conditions higher than the other? Does it fit your aim and your hypothesis? So really, that's really all you need to say about the mean. Really, the focus, I would say, is on standard deviation, because this tells you a lot more than the means do. So if you have a particularly high standard deviation for one or both conditions, then what does this tell you about the variability in performance per condition? A high standard deviation of, let's say, 12.6 tells you that there was a lot of variability in this condition. The scores veered quite widely from the mean. The scores were dispersed quite a lot from the mean. So at this point you can start to suggest why this may have happened. Do you think it was because this condition was more challenging than the other condition? Could it be because it required a specific skill that perhaps your participants might not have had a lot of practice in? Is it something to do with their age, with their experience? So this is where you can make suggestions as to why you think the standard deviation for one condition was higher than the other. And remember, when you have a low standard deviation, it tells you that the scores have all clustered around the mean. That tells you there's not a lot of variability. That increases the reliability. If you have a high standard deviation, that suggests something along the lines of maybe a lack of control on your part as researchers. Maybe it's because your group was small, you only had a small sample, therefore you are more likely to see a range of scores, possibly to see anomalous conditions, because large samples tend to iron those out, and you will not have been able to derive a large sample. So when you're evaluating sample size, link it to your statistics and to your results, because that is a far more viable and an interesting evaluation point than talking just about generalizability. Okay, so we'll come to that when we talk about sample. Now you need to analyze your inferential statistics as well. Look at the results you obtained. Were you fairly close to your critical value? Was it a long way off? Avoid saying that you had a very significant or only a slight level of significance. With significance, it's either significant or it's not significant. There's no kind of other measures there. So were you able to reject your null hypothesis, or did you have to accept it? Why was that? And it might be an idea to make a brief comment or two on the use of the Mann-Whitney, the Wilcoxon, or whatever the inferential test it was that you used. Personally, with my students, I only use Mann-Whitney for independent measures and Wilcoxon for repeated measures. You may have used another measure, but you need to talk to your teacher about that. So, explain why researchers use these measures. Why set the level of significance at 0.05? You might want to link it back to your procedure, your sample size, etc. And maybe bring in type 1 errors. Suggest. Just make suggestions here. You are free to do this now, it's the evaluation. What you must do, while we're still on the topic of results, is always discuss your results with reference to the background theory or model that you were investigating. You will lose marks if you don't do this. If you just say, these are our results, full stop, you are not going to get full marks. So do your results appear to suggest that serial position effect is affected by the use of a distraction task? What does that tell you about serial position effect? Go back to the theory. If you were doing Stroop, you might have done speed of processing theory, etc. But you must bring your theory or your model back into your discussion in the first part of your evaluation. Do your results seem to support the theory? If they don't, it's fine. Don't pretend that they do. This IA is your opportunity to show how aware you are of the limitations of conducting research as a student, and the fact that experiments don't always give the results that psychologists expect them to. No, you are not going to get marked down on not being able to support the theory and not getting a significant result. So don't worry, don't think I have to pretend I've got a significant result. It's actually, I think in some ways it can be easier if you don't get a significant result, because you've got more to analyse then and more to evaluate. Okay, so you need to evaluate the strengths and limitations of the whole process of putting together your IA. But really, you're really focusing on the next three sections that we're going to look at. Now, I've put evaluate your strengths briefly because there's not a lot of value to saying how good your IA is, because it will be apparent from the work you've done so far what the strengths are. So if you have chosen a theory that you can test, you have hypothesized in a way that is clear and apparent, you know what you're doing, you have talked about the variables you've controlled, you have justified your use of sampling method and design, that's all kind of already been taken care of. So you don't really need to go into a lot of detail with strengths. People who mark IA submissions are more interested in how you deal with the limitations. So I would say a third, maybe less than that, maybe a fifth on strengths and everything else on limitations. So when you are evaluating, it's got to be rigorous. You can't just say it was a lab experiment, therefore it was low in ecological validity. I mean, it's kind of, why bother saying that really? It's a bit pedestrian. Yes, of course, it's low in ecological validity. It's low in mundane realism. But you've got to say more than that. You've got to be rigorous if you want a high mark. There's nothing wrong with saying those things. It's just say a little bit more as well. So what you really look at are these 3 points here: the design, the strengths and limitations. Now, you've already justified your use of the design, so you don't need to spend a lot of time on the strengths of the design. Try not to repeat what you said in other parts of the IA. So when you justified using your design in the exploration section, don't repeat exactly what you said. Try and present the strength in a slightly different way, so it doesn't sound as if you're just repeating yourself. Now, the limitations are going to be more interesting. If you used repeated measures, it's more likely to produce demand characteristics, known as order effects. Did you counterbalance? Now, if you counterbalance, that's a good thing to mention as a strength. You can really go to town on that there. If you didn't counterbalance, well, say that you didn't and say that was a limitation, and that next time you would use counterbalancing because this helps with blah, 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 X, Y, Z. And if, depending on what design you used, you will be able to link it to your participants, link it to your procedure, and come up with some really good strengths and limitations. Now, with a sample and the sampling method, again, there's lots that you can say, and don't say exactly the same thing that you've said before. You've already mentioned what your sampling method is in the exploration. You justified it, but try to find a new spin on this when you're talking about strengths. Now, with the sampling method, I'm assuming pretty much all of you will have used an opportunity sampling method. No, you did not use random sampling. Students always get that wrong. You used an opportunity sampling method. There's a lot you can say about sources of bias here and why this is not a representative way of getting participants. And you need to evaluate the sample itself, but there's no point citing sample size as a limitation. It's apparently completely obvious that you will not have a large sample. You are students, and you are probably using students in your college or school to be your sample, so of course you're going to have a low sample size. I would always say to my students, link sample size to your results, to your quantitative data. A low sample size, small sample equals lack of robustness of data. There is no statistical power in 10 or even 20 participants. So link it to the power of the statistics, link it to whether you achieved a significant or a non-significant result. That's how to use sample size as an evaluation point. You could talk about generalizability as well here, of course. So your procedure, again, this is why you need to include a procedure as the final part of your exploration, because everything you evaluate in this section of the IA you should have already mentioned. If you suddenly start evaluating something that you've never mentioned before, it looks a bit odd. It doesn't add up. There's no kind of sense of continuity then about your IA. So make sure that you have a step-by-step procedure so you can refer to it. You can say, well, when we asked the participants to blah blah, we hadn't written standardized instructions, and it may be that we were ambiguous or unclear in our instructions. Next time, a good thing to do would be to write standardized instructions to increase the reliability and replicability of our procedure. So something like that, right? So do really examine your role as researchers, your use of materials. That says to use of, that should be your use of materials, and the experience of the participants in your experiment. I realise there are 2 typos there. I'm sorry about that. It should be the use of materials and the experience of participants. I must have been tired when I put this together. Too much marking of IAs, that's what it is. I would say bring in issues of reliability and validity to your evaluation, but not just on the surface. You're looking at things like internal validity, external validity, ecological validity, face validity, for example. Reliability, you might want to think about testing for external or internal reliability. Is it at all possible with what you've done? So really look at that. With reliability, you're looking at the level of control in the experiment, standardized procedure, replicability, all of those issues that really help to make a nice tight experiment. Okay, so definitely focus more on limitations and strengths. These do give you much more scope for a rigorous analysis. And always, 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 for every single limitation you highlight, you must suggest an improvement. And don't just say, I'd do it better next time. Ugh, that's blah. That's so vanilla as to be, well, not even vanilla. It's not even a flavour, is it? So, for example, how would you modify the limitations within your IA? Offer practical ideas. For example, the room we chose in which to conduct the experiment was rather small. Now, you might just stop there, but then you're going to lose marks. So you carry on, which meant that participants may have been able to see each other's responses. I would always say, use this phrase a lot. To improve this next time, we would select a larger experimental space with enough room between desks. And you may want to talk about sample size and say the sample was small, so we couldn't properly derive statistical power from it. And then you might say, well, next time we would hope to have a much larger sample. But then I think a good extra level of evaluation there is to also say, but this would prove problematic for student researchers. And you know, it is a lot easier as a professional researcher with access to larger samples And maybe talk about the fact that experiments need large samples because, again, of reliability, statistical power. If it's qualitative research, it doesn't really matter. Size does not matter with qualitative research. But I would just go further than most students are going to go in their IA and really, really think about extending your evaluation and flipping it over constantly, looking at what's the other side of this point? What's the other side of this point? Don't be content with just a pedestrian one-note evaluation. Okay. Think about the issues that are fundamental to your IA. What was the aim of your research? Keep going back to the beginning. What was the aim? Have you achieved your aim? What would you do differently? Maybe that is not necessarily a limitation, but just something you've thought of, a different spin on it. How far have you met this aim? How successful were you? And always bear in mind you are a student researcher. And if there's nothing wrong with bringing that into your evaluation, referring to the fact that you are a student. You know, it gives your work a kind of, it's like a maturity, a sense of authority that you are fully aware of your role as a researcher and aware of the limitations that come with it. Now, you don't necessarily get marked for a conclusion or for this next bit, but I always tell my students to finish your IA by including a conclusion. So what have you learned about the theory and what might future research in this field focus on? Again, you don't get marked on it, but it's nice. It's that little cherry on the icing on the cake. It leaves a good impression with the person marking it. For example, to conclude, this study did not highlight serial position effect in memory, possibly due to a lack of statistical power or uncontrolled variables, whatever you want to say. Now look at the use of that word possibly. If you put in because of this, it's too emphatic, it's too definite. Always possibly suggests that. Could be perhaps a result of. Never be definite in when you're writing about the results because you don't know what caused the results. You have no idea. It could be a range of variables that you have no idea about. This is why we need large numbers to kind of erode that level of doubt a bit. So put words like possibly. Future research might consider the influence of gender on serial position effect, using a much larger sample to increase the reliability of the findings. Nice way to end it, yeah? It makes you sound confident and professional, and that's how real psychology reports are written. So, that's it for the evaluation. There are 3 other videos on the IA. I am also going to add a help video. A video. I honestly have been doing so much marking, I can't even think properly. A video to help you run your inferential statistical tests. That's what I meant to say. So please keep your eye out for that. And good luck with your IA. I hope you get a level 7.